So this is gonna sound weird, but I've been thinking about this story a lot lately and I figured I should probably write it down somewhere. Maybe it'll help me stop thinking about it, you know? This happened a few years back when I did some time, nothing serious, just got caught up in some stupid stuff when I was younger. Possession charges, if you really want to know. Not proud of it, but it is what it is. I was at this medium security place upstate for about 8 months. The thing about jail is that most people think it's all fights and gangs and whatever, but honestly it's mostly just boring. Really, really boring. You spend a lot of time just sitting around, waiting for meals, waiting for yard time, waiting for lights out. I got paired up with this cellmate about 2 months into my sentence. The guy they brought in was probably late 20s, Native American, pretty average height but kinda stocky. Not fat, just solid, like he'd done physical work his whole life. He didn't say much when they brought him in, just nodded at me and started putting his stuff away. The guards called him Martinez, but I found out later his first name was Tommy. First thing I noticed about Tommy was how quiet he was. And I don't mean just quiet like he didn't talk much, I mean quiet like he barely made any noise when he moved around. Most people, you can hear them walking across the cell, hear them shifting on their bunk, hear them breathing when they sleep. Tommy was like a ghost. Sometimes I'd think he wasn't even in the cell and then I'd look over and there he was, just sitting on his bunk reading or staring at the wall. He had this paperback book that looked like it had been read about 100 times, some Western novel. The cover was completely worn off. He'd read the same book over and over, front to back, then start again. The thing about being locked up with someone is that you start noticing all their little habits whether you want to or not. Tommy didn't sleep well, at all. I'd hear him tossing and turning most of the night, and sometimes he'd talk in his sleep. It wasn't English, whatever he was saying. The words were longer, more flowing, and sometimes it sounded like he was having a conversation with someone, like there would be pauses where he was listening to someone else talk. About 6 weeks after Tommy arrived, we had this night where the AC was broken and it was hotter than hell. Nobody was sleeping well, and Tommy suddenly spoke up from his bunk. "You awake?" he asked, which was probably the first time he'd initiated any conversation since he got there. We talked a little about family and I found out he was from New Mexico on the reservation. But then, just as I was starting to drift off, he said something that stuck with me. "Sometimes I miss it so much it feels like something's eating me from the inside out. But I can't go back. Not after what happened." The next time Tommy really opened up was maybe 2 weeks later, during one of those nights when neither of us could sleep. He started telling me about his cousin Danny. "Danny was like my brother," Tommy told me. "Our moms were sisters, and after my parents died, I basically lived at his house half the time. We were the same age, born 2 months apart, and we did everything together." According to Tommy, Danny was one of those people who was just naturally good at everything. Better athlete, better student, and especially better at all the traditional skills Tommy's grandmother tried to teach them both. Danny could track a rabbit across hard ground, could tell you what the weather was going to do just by looking at the sky. He was the kind of guy who other people looked up to, even when they were kids. After high school, most of their friends left for college or moved to the cities for work, but Danny and Tommy stayed. They both got jobs with the tribal council, doing maintenance work mostly. It was a good life, simple but good. Tommy thought it would always be like that. The change started about 3 years ago. Danny had been talking for months about wanting to go on this big hunting trip, way up in the mountains north of the reservation. He was obsessed with this one particular area, said he'd found sign of a really big bull up there. Tommy wasn't as enthusiastic about the trip, but Danny kept pushing it, got really intense about it, more intense than Tommy had ever seen him about anything. So finally Tommy agreed. They planned the trip for early October, hiked about 8 miles to the area Danny had scouted, and set up camp near a small stream. The first day went fine, but the second day Danny wanted to split up. That wasn't unusual, but something about the way Danny suggested it bothered Tommy. He had this look in his eyes, like he was excited about something, but not in a good way. They agreed to meet back at camp by sunset, and Danny headed off toward the Northridge. Tommy spent most of the day following what looked like fresh elk sign, but as the day went on he started noticing that the woods seemed unusually quiet, no bird calls, no squirrels chattering. It felt like everything was hiding, like there was something in those woods that all the animals were afraid of. When Tommy got back to camp around 6 p.m., Danny wasn't there. By 8 o'clock, when it was getting dark, Tommy started to worry. He spent about an hour calling Danny's name and shining his flashlight around, but there was no response. Tommy barely slept that night, and Danny finally showed up the next morning just as Tommy was getting ready to hike out and call for help. Danny walked into camp like nothing had happened, acting completely normal, asking if Tommy had seen any elk. But something was different about him. Tommy couldn't put his finger on what exactly, but something had changed. When Tommy asked where Danny had been all night, Danny just said he'd been tracking a big bull and had followed it farther than he meant to. It was a reasonable explanation, but there were little things that bothered Tommy. Danny's clothes weren't dirty enough for someone who'd spent a night sleeping on the ground. His boots weren't muddy. The whole drive back, Danny was different. Quieter than usual, but also like he was listening to something Tommy couldn't hear. Tommy figured Danny was just tired, but it wasn't until they'd been back home for a week that Tommy started to realize the change in Danny wasn't temporary. He stopped coming around as much. Before the hunting trip, Danny was at Tommy's grandmother's house at least 3 times a week. After they got back, Tommy might see him once a week, and when he did come by, he seemed distant. At work, their supervisors started commenting on how quiet Danny had gotten. Danny used to be the guy who would joke around with coworkers, but suddenly he was keeping to himself, eating lunch alone. The first really weird thing happened about a month after the hunting trip. Tommy's grandmother had asked both him and Danny to come over to help her move some furniture. Tommy showed up on time, but Danny was about an hour late. When he finally arrived, Tommy's grandmother took one look at him and stepped back like she'd seen something that scared her. She started speaking in Navajo, which she hardly ever did around them, and her voice sounded worried. Really worried. That night, Tommy's grandmother called him over and asked if Danny had been acting different lately. When Tommy said yes, she got this really serious look on her face. She told Tommy that there are some places in the mountains that people aren't supposed to go alone, places where the boundary between our world and other things isn't as solid as it should be. She said Danny had the smell of one of those places on him. Tommy's grandmother told him to watch Danny carefully, said that sometimes when people go to certain places alone, they don't come back the same as when they left. Sometimes they come back changed. At first, Tommy didn't want to believe what his grandmother was implying, but over the next few weeks, he started paying closer attention to Danny's behavior. The first thing Tommy really noticed was how Danny moved differently. Too smoothly, like he was floating instead of walking. And he was quiet. Not just quiet like he wasn't talking much, but quiet like he barely made any sound when he moved around. Tommy started making excuses to spend more time around Danny, trying to figure out what was different about him. Danny stopped eating meat, well, cooked meat anyway. They'd go to restaurants and he'd order salads, or he'd just push food around on his plate without really eating it. But then Tommy started noticing that when they'd go to Danny's house, there would be packages of raw hamburger in his fridge that were opened and half gone. There were other changes too. Danny had always been social, but suddenly he seemed to avoid crowds. And the dogs, Danny had always been great with animals, especially dogs. His family had this old yellow lab named Chester who used to follow Danny everywhere. After the hunting trip, Chester wouldn't go near him. The breaking point came about 2 months after the hunting trip. Tommy was having trouble sleeping and had decided to go for a late-night drive. It was maybe 2 in the morning, and he was driving past Danny's house when he saw lights on in the kitchen. Tommy figured Danny was having trouble sleeping too, so he pulled into his driveway. The front door was unlocked, which was weird because Danny had gotten really paranoid about locking doors after the hunting trip. Tommy let himself in and called Danny's name, but didn't get an answer. He could hear sounds coming from the kitchen, so he walked back there to see what Danny was up to. What he saw still gives him nightmares. Danny was sitting on the kitchen floor with his back to the doorway, hunched over something. There were torn packages scattered around him, packages of raw ground beef, raw chicken, even some raw fish. He was eating it with his hands, just grabbing handfuls of raw meat and shoving it in his mouth. And the sounds he was making weren't like a person eating, like an animal. Tommy stood in the doorway for what felt like forever, trying to process what he was seeing. Then Danny seemed to sense that someone was watching him. He turned around real slow, and when he looked at Tommy, his eyes reflected the light from the overhead fixture. Just like an animal's eyes do when you shine a flashlight at them in the dark. Danny stared at Tommy for several seconds without saying anything. His face was smeared with blood from the raw meat, and there was something wrong with his expression. Not embarrassed like you'd expect, but more like he was evaluating whether Tommy was a threat. Then he smiled, but it wasn't Danny's smile. It was too wide, and Tommy could see that his teeth looked different, sharper. Tommy backed out of the kitchen and headed for the front door, moving as calmly as he could manage. Danny didn't follow him, didn't say anything, just watched him leave. After that night, Tommy started avoiding Danny as much as possible. But Danny seemed to know that Tommy was avoiding him, and he didn't like it. He started showing up at Tommy's house at weird times. Tommy would come home from work and Danny would be sitting on his front porch, just waiting. Or Tommy would wake up in the middle of the night and see Danny's truck parked across the street, and he could see him sitting in the cab, watching Tommy's house. When Tommy tried talking to other family members about his concerns, nobody wanted to hear it. His aunt told him he was being ridiculous, said Danny had always been a little different, and maybe he was just growing up. But Tommy's grandmother believed him. When he told her about finding Danny eating raw meat in his kitchen, she got that same worried look. She told Tommy there were stories about people who went to certain places and came back wrong. People who looked like themselves but weren't themselves anymore. She said the old people had words for it, ceremonies that were supposed to help, but that kind of knowledge had been mostly lost. The final straw came about a week later when Tommy woke up one night and found Danny standing in his bedroom. Tommy doesn't know how he got in. He'd started locking all his doors and windows, even installed deadbolts. But he woke up around 3 in the morning and Danny was just standing at the foot of his bed, staring at him. Tommy didn't want to move. Something about the way Danny was standing there, perfectly still, watching him sleep. It felt like if he moved or said something, it might trigger Danny to do something worse. But eventually Tommy worked up the courage to speak. He said Danny's name quietly and asked what he was doing there. Danny didn't answer right away, just kept staring. And then he said, in this voice that didn't sound quite like his normal voice, "You've been talking about me." Tommy tried to sit up in bed, but Danny stepped closer, and Tommy could see his eyes reflecting what little light was in the room. Tommy told him he hadn't been talking about him, but Danny just shook his head and said, "I can smell it on you. Fear. Suspicion. You think you know something about me." Danny moved closer to the bed and Tommy could smell something wrong, not like body odor, but something wild and animal-like, like the smell of a predator's den. Danny leaned down close to Tommy's face and whispered, "I know what you saw in my kitchen. I know what you told grandmother. And I know you're thinking about leaving." Tommy asked how Danny could know he was thinking about leaving since he hadn't told anyone. Danny smiled that too wide smile again. He said, "I know because I can hear your thoughts when you're scared. And you're scared of me all the time now." Tommy asked him what happened to him up in the mountains, what he'd found up there, or what had found him. For just a second, Danny's expression changed. He looked confused, maybe even scared, like the real Danny was still in there somewhere, trying to remember. But then the moment passed, and Danny's expression went back to that predatory stare. He told Tommy that he'd found something up in those mountains that he'd been looking for his whole life without knowing it. Said he'd been chosen for something important, something that would make him stronger and better than he'd ever been before. Before he left, Danny turned around and said, "You can leave if you want to. Run away to the city, try to forget about home. But I'll always know where you are. I'll always be able to find you if I need to." And then Danny was gone. Tommy heard the front door close, heard Danny's truck start up and drive away. But when Tommy got up to check, all his doors were still locked from the inside. That was it for Tommy. He couldn't stay there anymore. He spent the next week making arrangements to leave. He quit his job, told his grandmother he needed to get away for a while, and packed everything important into his truck. His grandmother understood, didn't try to talk him out of it. She gave him some things, herbs and a small pouch with something in it that she said would help protect him. Tommy drove east, not really sure where he was going, just wanting to put as much distance as possible between himself and Danny. He ended up in Denver first, then Kansas City, then eventually here. He got a job doing construction, found a cheap apartment, tried to build a normal life. And for about 6 months, it worked. He started sleeping better, stopped looking over his shoulder all the time. But Tommy's peace of mind didn't last. He started getting phone calls at weird hours. 3 a.m., 4 a.m., and when he'd answer, nobody would be there. Just breathing, sometimes what sounded like whispering in that language Tommy didn't recognize. Then he started seeing him, not Danny exactly, but shapes that looked like him in his peripheral vision. The breaking point came when Tommy woke up one morning and found muddy footprints on his apartment floor. They started at the front door, walked through his living room and kitchen, and ended at his bedroom door. The footprints were the right size to be Danny's, but they weren't quite the right shape. They looked more like animal tracks, like something with claws instead of toenails. Tommy called his grandmother that day, and she told him that Danny had been asking about him, wanting to know where Tommy had gone, whether he'd been in touch with family, when he might be coming back to visit. She said Danny had changed even more since Tommy left. He hardly came around during the day anymore, but people had started seeing him at night, walking around the reservation alone. And there had been some incidents with livestock, cattle and horses found dead, but not killed by coyotes or mountain lions. Something bigger. That night, Tommy decided he needed to disappear more completely. He emptied his bank account, ditched his cell phone, and started moving around more frequently. But you can't live like that forever. Always moving, always looking over your shoulder, never able to trust anyone or get close to anyone. It wears you down. Tommy started drinking more, started making bad decisions. He got involved with some people who were selling drugs, started using drugs himself, anything to quiet the constant anxiety and paranoia. Eventually, he got careless and got busted in a drug sweep. Simple possession, but with his transient lifestyle, he couldn't make bail. So he sat in county jail, and eventually took a plea deal that got him the 8-month sentence that brought him to the same facility where I met him. In a weird way, Tommy said jail felt safer than trying to hide on the outside. At least here, he knew Danny couldn't get to him. At least here, he could sleep through the night without worrying about waking up and finding footprints on his floor. But even in jail, Tommy didn't feel completely safe. He'd still get those weird phone calls sometimes, and sometimes when he'd look out the window during yard time, he'd see someone standing at the edge of the woods beyond the fence. Too far away to see clearly, but the right height and build to be Danny. Just standing there, watching. Tommy had about 3 more months left on his sentence when he told me all this. He said he didn't know if he could keep running forever, but he didn't know what else to do. He couldn't go home. He wouldn't put his grandmother in danger, and he couldn't face whatever Danny had become. But he couldn't keep living like this either. That was the longest conversation we'd had since Tommy arrived, and it was the first time I'd heard him sound truly desperate. After that night, Tommy seemed a little more relaxed around me, like getting the story out had relieved some of the pressure he'd been carrying. But he also seemed more anxious about his upcoming release date. The closer it got, the more restless he became. Tommy got released about 2 months before I did. On his last day, he thanked me for listening to his stories and said he hoped he'd find a way to stay hidden from whatever Danny had become. I never heard from Tommy after he left, and I never tried to track him down. Part of me hopes he found peace somewhere, and part of me worries that Danny eventually found him.
So my friend Tyler told me this story a few years after he got back from his Mormon mission, and I still think about it sometimes. Tyler and I went to high school together. He was one of those really earnest guys who actually meant it when he talked about wanting to help people. When he turned 19, he got called to serve on the Navajo reservation in Arizona, which was exactly what he'd hoped for. What made Tyler's situation unusual was that instead of living in an apartment with his companion, he stayed with a host family, the Yazis. There was the grandmother Shimisani, her son Robert who worked for tribal government, and Robert's 16-year-old daughter Ayana. Tyler said the first 6 weeks were great. Shimisani would cook traditional meals and teach him Navajo words. Robert would tell stories about the area, and Ayanna mostly treated him like an annoying older brother. But Tyler started noticing their evening routine was weird. As soon as the sun got low, the whole family would change. Shimasani would check all doors and windows were locked. Robert would close curtains and turn off lights. Ayanna would put away her phone and sit quietly. When Tyler asked about it, Robert said it was about being energy conscious. Tyler also noticed they burned sage constantly, especially in the evenings, with Shimasani standing by windows looking out with an expression Tyler couldn't read. The first time Tyler saw the figure was in early December. He was helping Robert bring in firewood when he noticed someone standing at the property edge, maybe 100 yards away where the scrubland met juniper trees. Tyler waved at the figure, but it didn't wave back, didn't move at all. Just stood there perfectly still, facing the house. When Tyler asked Robert if he was expecting anyone, Robert looked where Tyler pointed, but didn't say anything, just picked up his firewood and headed inside. When Tyler looked back, the figure was gone. That night at dinner, Tyler mentioned seeing someone by the trees. When he described what he'd seen, the conversation stopped completely. Shimasani and Robert exchanged worried looks, and Ayanna asked exactly where and what time. When Tyler said sunset near the eastern tree line, Ayanna got an expression Tyler had never seen, serious concern. Shimasani said something in Navajo, and Robert told Tyler, sometimes people cut through the property, nothing to worry about. But Tyler could tell they were more concerned than they were letting on. After dinner, Shimasani burned more sage than ever, carrying it to every window, spending extra time on the ones facing east. 2 nights later, Tyler saw the figure again while studying alone after the family went to bed. This time it was maybe 20 yards closer to the house. In moonlight, Tyler could see it was definitely human-shaped, but something about the posture looked wrong, too still, like standing at an uncomfortable angle. Tyler watched for 10 minutes until the figure simply wasn't there anymore. He didn't see it leave. Over the next few days, Tyler started noticing things he'd missed before. Starting around sunset, there'd be this faint smell drifting across the property, like roadkill that had been lying in the sun too long. It would come and go, stronger on the eastern side where Tyler had seen the figure. He also found weird tracks around the house. Some looked like normal footprints, others like bare feet with toes too long, and the strangest one seemed to transition from human prints to animal tracks with claws. When Tyler showed the tracks to Robert, he stared at them for a long time before saying there were lots of stray dogs in the area. But Tyler could tell Robert was just giving him an explanation to avoid talking about it. The situation escalated when Tyler saw the figure during daylight. He was walking back to the house after missionary work when he looked toward the tree line, and there it was, and seeing it clearly was much worse. The figure was human-shaped, but the proportions were wrong. Arms too long, torso too narrow, head at the wrong angle. And it was definitely watching Tyler, turning to follow his movement. Tyler decided to approach it directly. He started walking across the scrubland, calling out to ask if the person needed help. But as he got closer, the smell hit him. That roadkill scent, but much stronger, mixed with wet dog fur and something chemical. Tyler made it halfway before the smell became so overwhelming he had to cover his nose with his shirt. The figure hadn't moved, was still watching him. Tyler called out one more time, and the figure tilted its head like listening, but didn't respond or do anything a normal person would do. Tyler retreated, and when he looked back from the porch, the figure was gone. That evening, he told the family about the encounter, and this time, there was no pretending it wasn't serious. Shimasani started talking rapidly in Navajo, clearly upset. Robert asked specific questions about what Tyler had seen. Ayanna translated some of what Shimasani said, something about Tyler being more careful about not approaching things that didn't belong. That was the first time anyone acknowledged there might be something dangerous about the figure. The family's evening routine became even stricter, all doors locked before sunset, nobody outside after dark. Shimasani increased the sage burning and started placing herb bundles at windows and doorways. Tyler felt like they were living under siege. When Tyler asked Robert directly what they thought was happening, Robert finally gave him a straight answer. He said there were old stories about things that weren't quite human, things that could look like people or animals but weren't really either. These things were attracted to outsiders sometimes, especially people who didn't understand local customs. The family had been trying to keep Tyler safe, but whatever was watching the house was getting more persistent. The figures started appearing more frequently, always closer than before. Tyler would catch glimpses during the day, sometimes at the tree-line, sometimes crossing open ground, once at the edge of the driveway. The smell was getting stronger and constant now, that roadkill scent mixed with wet fur and chemicals. Tyler found more tracks, bolder ones, right next to the building, under windows on the porch steps. More looked like animal prints now, bigger than any dog, and some looked like human handprints with fingers too long and claw marks at the tips. One morning, Tyler found tracks leading from the tree-line directly to his bedroom window, then around the entire house. The prints under his window were deeper, like whatever made them had stood there a long time. Shimisani got visibly upset when she saw them and had a rapid argument with Robert in Navajo. Robert finally told Tyler his mother thought he should move to a different room without windows facing east. That night, Tyler barely slept. He kept hearing sounds outside, footsteps on gravel, something brushing against the house, scratching at windows. Around 3 a.m., he heard someone trying the front door handle very softly. Tyler crept to the window, but couldn't see anyone, though he could smell that rotting chemical smell much stronger, like whatever caused it was very close. He had the overwhelming feeling something was watching him back. The next morning, Tyler found handprints on the front door, not normal ones, but with fingers too long and claw marks where fingertips should be. When Robert saw them, his reaction was the most alarmed Tyler had seen. Robert went inside and made a stress phone call in Navajo. When he came back, he said he'd talked to community elders who thought Tyler should leave immediately. But before Tyler could arrange anything, Ayanna started acting strange. She'd been withdrawn for days, spending time staring out windows, not eating, looking like she wasn't sleeping. The night everything changed, Tyler was woken around midnight by voices outside. He realized it was Ayanna talking to someone, her voice sounding different, older, more confident. But he couldn't hear the other person's responses. When Tyler went to wake Robert, he found him already awake, fully dressed like he'd been waiting. "You heard her too," Robert said. He explained Ayanna had been going outside at night for a week, and he and Shimisani had been taking turns staying awake to watch. Tyler asked why they didn't stop her, and Robert said they were afraid interfering would make things worse. The voices stopped. They heard the door open and close, footsteps to Ayanna's room. Robert told Tyler he'd already contacted Tyler's mission president. Arrangements were being made to transfer Tyler immediately. Robert said whatever was watching the house was specifically interested in Tyler, and Ayanna was being used to communicate with him. They were afraid if Tyler stayed longer, something bad would happen to everyone. The next morning, Ayanna was gone. Her room was empty, bed not slept in, clothes scattered like she'd changed quickly. Her shoes were by the back door, which was unlocked though Robert had locked it. Outside were tracks leading to the tree line, some like Ayanna's bare feet, others like those strange animal prints Tyler had been seeing. When they realized Ayanna was missing, the family's reaction was unlike anything Tyler expected. Instead of calling police, Robert and Shimisani seemed to shut down, like they'd been expecting this. Tyler kept asking about calling 911, but Robert said that wouldn't help. Police wouldn't understand what happened or know how to find her. Robert explained there were old stories about things that looked like people but weren't, things hungry for something humans had. These entities were attracted to unclear boundaries, different cultures meeting people away from home, vulnerable situations. Missionaries were particularly at risk. The family had hoped their protections would be enough, but Tyler's presence had attracted something too persistent. Robert said the figure had been testing their defenses for months, using Ayanna as the weak point to get information about Tyler and their routines. He thought Ayanna was still alive, but wasn't herself anymore. Sometimes these things would take people and change them to get closer to other targets. Tyler's new companion arrived that afternoon to transfer him over 200 miles away. Shimisani gave Tyler bundles of sage and herbs tied with protective knots, making him promise to carry them and burn sage regularly. When Tyler asked if Ayanna could be saved, Shimisani said the girl they'd known was probably gone forever. Tyler tried calling the family for updates, but after a month the number was disconnected. The local church said they'd moved without leaving forwarding information. Tyler realized the family had to abandon their entire life because of what his presence brought to them. Tyler went home from his mission early, telling people he'd had health issues. He tried to forget about it, but years later he hired an investigator. Robert had died in a car accident, Shimisani had passed away, and there was no record of what happened to Ayanna. She'd just disappeared from all official records. When Tyler told me this story, he asked me to think carefully about sharing it. He said some things are better left as stories a few people know rather than investigations that put more people at risk. I think Tyler made the right choice in leaving when he did and not going back for answers that might be better left unasked. But I also think about Ayanna sometimes and wonder if she's still out there somewhere and what she might have become.
So my Uncle Rick told me this story a few years ago and I've been thinking about it ever since. Rick's always been the guy in our family who has weird stories, but this one he only told once, and when he finished, he looked like he wished he hadn't brought it up. Rick's in his 50s now, quiet guy who never married. He bounced around doing different kinds of work, construction, truck driving, warehouse jobs. About 8 years ago, he was living in Montana doing seasonal logging work. When winter came, he needed something to pay the bills and saw an ad for overnight security at a government weather monitoring facility about 30 miles outside of town. It was perfect for Rick. Decent pay, quiet work, just him and a bunch of equipment that mostly ran itself. The facility was just a collection of low buildings surrounded by chain-link fence with weather monitoring equipment scattered around. Radio towers, satellite dishes, things that measured wind speed and precipitation. Rick's job was straightforward: show up at 10 p.m., monitor computer screens, do walking patrols every 2 hours. Most nights, absolutely nothing happened. He'd do his rounds, sit in the control room reading paperback novels, maybe call in routine status reports. The most exciting thing was when deer would trigger the motion sensors. Rick worked alone like this for about 4 months through the Montana winter. He said it was some of the most peaceful work he'd ever done. But then the company decided they needed 2-person teams for safety. Rick wasn't happy about it. He'd gotten used to working alone. His supervisor said they'd found someone with security experience who could start Monday. The new guy had good references and seemed reliable. Monday night, Rick met his new partner. "This is Mike," the supervisor said, gesturing to a man in his early 40s, average height, thin build, dark hair going gray. Mike shook Rick's hand and said quietly, "Good to meet you." The first thing Rick noticed was how quiet Mike was. Not unfriendly, just economical with words. When Rick tried making conversation, Mike gave brief answers that didn't invite follow-up. What surprised Rick was how quickly Mike understood the job. Rick expected to spend nights training him, but Mike already knew his way around. He knew which monitors tracked which systems, knew the building layouts. When Rick asked about it, Mike said he'd reviewed the facility manuals beforehand. The first night went smoothly. Mike brought coffee, suggested they split patrol routes for efficiency. Around 1 a.m., a wind speed monitor started acting up. Rick was just noticing the problem when Mike said he'd been watching it for 10 minutes, figured it would stabilize. Mike was right, it did. But Rick wondered how Mike had spotted the issue first. There was something about Mike that bothered Rick. Maybe how still he sat. Most people fidget, but Mike could sit motionless for hours, just watching the screens. Around 4 a.m., Rick glanced at the security monitor showing the equipment yard where Mike was patrolling. He could see Mike walking between the weather stations, but something looked off. Mike seemed to be moving too smoothly, like gliding instead of walking. Rick thought maybe the camera was malfunctioning. When Mike returned, Rick asked about his patrol route. Mike described exactly the path Rick had seen, but Rick made a mental note about possible camera issues. The second night, Rick paid closer attention. During their patrol, he suggested they stick together so he could show Mike shortcuts. But Mike already knew which doors stuck, which equipment housings had tricky latches. When Rick asked how, Mike said he'd walked around during his dinner break. Around midnight, an atmospheric pressure sensor started showing crazy readings. Rick was just reading the alert when Mike said, "That sensor's about to cascade into other systems. We should call it in." Mike was right, the sensor failure was affecting multiple systems. The technician they called seemed surprised they'd caught the cascading effect so quickly. Said most teams would just report the initial problem. What really bothered Rick happened during the 2 a.m. round. They'd split up, and Rick finished his section quickly. He could see Mike's flashlight in the equipment yard, but when Rick checked the security monitor covering that area, Mike wasn't visible on screen. When Mike returned, he described walking through the exact area the camera should have shown. By the third night, Rick was systematically watching the security monitors whenever Mike was on patrol. What he saw didn't make sense. Mike would appear on one camera, disappear, then show up on a camera covering an area he couldn't have reached that quickly. Rick started timing the movements. Mike was covering impossible distances in seconds. Rick tried convincing himself the camera system was faulty, but when he tested it himself, the timing was normal. On the fourth night, Rick suggested they patrol together the entire shift. Working alongside Mike, Rick noticed things he'd missed before. Mike never got winded during outdoor patrols, even walking quickly through snow. His footprints seemed to disappear faster than Rick's, like snow was filling them in unnaturally quick. The strangest thing was how wildlife reacted to Mike. Deer would usually run when they heard people coming, but around Mike, they'd watch without fleeing, the way prey animals watch predators. During one patrol, Mike suddenly stopped at a fence section that looked identical to every other part. "Something's wrong over there," he said, walking straight to a specific post. He found clean cuts in the chain link, recent damage from wire cutters positioned to allow someone through. Rick asked how Mike knew to look there. Mike said the fence post was slightly out of alignment, but Rick had walked past that spot dozens of times without noticing anything wrong. They reported the damage, and their supervisor was impressed they'd caught an attempted break-in. By the end of the first week, Rick was filling a notebook with observations about Mike's abilities. Individual incidents could be explained away, but together they painted a picture of someone who knew more than should be possible for a new employee. The breaking point came during the second week. Rick had been monitoring security feeds whenever Mike patrolled alone, and he started noticing the person on camera didn't quite match Mike's actual appearance. Sometimes the figure was slightly taller or shorter, sometimes the hair looked different. But one night, the differences became dramatic. Rick was watching the camera feed of Mike's patrol when he saw the figure moving wrong, too fluid, inhuman smooth. The face was sharper, eyes darker, expression nothing like Mike's usual calm demeanor. When Mike returned 20 minutes later, he looked exactly like himself. Rick started taking screenshots of the discrepancies, though he wasn't sure what to do with the evidence. Rick began following Mike at a distance during patrols, comparing reality to the camera feeds. He discovered Mike's actual routes didn't match what the cameras showed. Rick would see Mike head north, but cameras showed a figure working in the south. It was like there were two versions of Mike doing different things in different locations. The final incident happened on a Friday during the fourth week. Rick was monitoring cameras when he saw something impossible. The figure moved like it was imitating human movement without understanding it, taking normal steps then suddenly covering huge distances in single strides, bending to examine equipment in physically uncomfortable ways. The figure moved through the grounds with impossible efficiency, going directly to equipment that needed attention without searching. Then it looked straight at the camera and smiled, not Mike's smile, but something wider with too many teeth, directed at the camera like it knew Rick was watching. When Mike returned looking completely normal, Rick spent the night trying to act natural while wondering what he was sharing the control room with. That weekend, Rick decided he needed answers. Monday night, he told Mike he'd seen suspicious movement near the Eastern Equipment Yard, suggesting they investigate together. Mike seemed genuinely concerned, asking appropriate questions as they searched the perimeter. For 10 minutes, everything seemed normal. Then Mike stopped and stood perfectly still, head tilted like listening to something Rick couldn't hear. "There's nobody here," Mike said. "There's nobody anywhere near here." But he said it with absolute certainty, like he knew no one else was within miles. Rick asked how he could be sure. Mike looked at him with an expression Rick had never seen. Intense and calculating. "I can smell everything within a 2-mile radius," Mike said. "I can hear every heartbeat, every breath, every footstep. There are no humans here except you and me." As Mike spoke, Rick watched his features change, not just expression but actual bone structure. His jaw became more pronounced, eyes darker, and when he smiled, his teeth were much sharper. "I think you've been watching me, Rick," Mike said. "I think you've figured out I'm not exactly what I appear to be." Mike explained he was something very good at pretending to be human, working security jobs at remote facilities for decades before moving on when people started asking questions. He said places like this were perfect, isolated, minimal human contact, surrounded by wilderness where he could spend free time in his natural form. Rick asked what Mike planned to do about his knowledge. Mike's expression became almost sad. "I like you, Rick. You've been respectful about your suspicions. So I'm giving you a choice." Rick could quit immediately, move away, never talk about what he'd learned, and Mike would move on to another location. Or Mike could ensure Rick never talked to anyone about anything again. Mike's tone was matter-of-fact, like discussing routine procedure. When Rick asked about other workers' safety, Mike seemed surprised. He had no interest in harming humans who weren't threats. "I'm not a monster," Mike said. "I'm just something different that needs to be careful about interaction with your species." Rick chose to leave. He submitted his resignation, moved to Oregon, found work at a shopping mall, lots of people, well-lit areas, nothing isolated. He never contacted his old job but occasionally checked online. The facility had unusually high security staff turnover, at least 8 different guards in 3 years. Rick wondered if Mike was still there and if other guards had figured out what he had. Rick never found news reports about missing persons in the area, which he took as a good sign that Mike kept his word. When Rick told me the story, he made me promise not to share it with family. He said he just needed someone else to know in case something happened to him. That was 5 years ago. Rick's doing fine, but he's never told another story like that one. Sometimes I wonder if working alone affected his perception, but Rick's always been practical and level-headed. There's something about the specific details and genuine fear in his voice that makes me think he was telling the truth. I've never tried researching that facility, and I don't plan to. If Mike's still out there working security jobs at isolated places, I don't want to draw his attention. Rick made a deal to keep Mike's secret, and I'm honoring that too. But I think about his story sometimes, especially hearing about remote jobs with high turnover or unexplained incidents at isolated facilities. I wonder how many things are out there that are good at pretending to be human, and how many people have figured out the truth and chosen to keep quiet about it.